The Veythari ambassador's shuttle broke atmosphere over the northern hemisphere at dawn, and the first reading that crossed Thyra Vel Anisi's tactical display was a frequency map that should not have existed. She had expected electromagnetic noise. Every species at the early interstellar stage produced it, the chaotic radio scatter of a young civilization learning to shout into the dark, the unfiltered thermal bleed of industry not yet refined, the overlapping signal hash of a world still arguing with itself about how to organize its own communications. The Continuance's first contact protocols were built around that noise. It was the signature of readiness. A species noisy enough to be heard was mature enough to be welcomed. Sol 3 was not noisy. Sol 3 was silent, and in that silence, a single carrier wave pulsed across every frequency band simultaneously, so precisely modulated that her signal officer, a veteran of 19 first contact missions, spent 40 seconds recalibrating his instruments before he turned and said, "Ambassador, that carrier is not natural. It is a controlled planetary broadcast. Someone down there is running a spectrum management system that covers the entire electromagnetic output of the world." Spectrum management, Thyra repeated. Total, every frequency allocated, assigned, disciplined. No noise, no waste, no bleed. Whatever civilization is operating down there, it has organized its electromagnetic environment the way we organize ours. Thyra absorbed that without visible reaction. She had spent the 9-month transit from the Veythari Continuance studying the original survey files on Sol 3, and she had built her mission plan around what those files described. A promising mammalian species, socially organized but pre-agricultural, showing early tool specialization and abstract communication. The survey had been professional and definitive. A species at that stage would reach early spaceflight within 200,000 years and stable interstellar communication within 300,000. The developmental models had a 96% accuracy rate across 42 contacted species and 1,100 integrated worlds. 300,000 years had passed. The contact window had opened. Thyra was here. She carried credentials from the Continuance's highest diplomatic authority, a cultural integration package calibrated for species at the early interstellar stage, and a formal invitation to join the Veythari Continuance's network. 1,100 worlds, 42 species, all welcomed at precisely this developmental moment, all guided into productive partnership under Veythari oversight. The package included technological uplift protocols, governance templates, interstellar navigation training, and a diplomatic acculturation curriculum refined across 8,000 successful integrations. It was, by any standard, a generous framework, a gift. The Continuance did not conquer, it welcomed. It was the oldest civilization in the known galaxy, and its method was patience. Find them early, wait for them to grow, arrive when they were ready, and offer them a place in something larger. Every species had accepted, every one. But the signal officer's report had just told her something the models had not predicted. The species below had not merely achieved interstellar communication. It had mastered its own planet's electromagnetic environment to a degree that the Continuance itself had not reached until approximately 80,000 years after its own first spaceflight. Renith. She turned to her aide, who occupied the secondary console with the focused stillness of a man who had already seen the same data and was waiting for permission to speak. Pull the full sensor package. Everything. Atmospheric composition, magnetic field structure, orbital scan, surface topology. Complete environmental profile before we descend below 100 kilometers. Renith worked. The shuttle held altitude, circling the planet in the wide survey orbit that protocols designated as passive observation. Data accumulated on Thyra's display, and she felt the careful architecture of her mission. 2 decades of preparation, 4 years of continuance debate, 9 months of transit, begin to deform under what the instruments reported. The atmospheric composition was engineered, not polluted, not degraded, engineered. Carbon dioxide held at a precise value, optimizing biological productivity and thermal regulation. Oxygen-nitrogen ratio within 2 decimal points of what the continuance maintained on its core worlds. Trace gases either absent or present at concentrations serving specific biological or industrial functions. Methane at levels consistent with large-scale agricultural management. Ozone distribution uniform and clearly maintained by artificial intervention. Someone had taken this planet's atmosphere and tuned it the way the continuance tuned its oldest homeworld. The magnetic field was structured, not the natural dipole of a geologically active planet. It was layered, carrying artificial harmonics that Renith identified as embedded communication and navigation systems woven into the planet's own magnetosphere. Someone had threaded the magnetic field with infrastructure the way the continuance threaded its core worlds. But the continuance had taken 40,000 years to develop that capability after first spaceflight. And the orbital space was occupied. 14 confirmed structures in low orbit, Renith reported, his voice flattening into the cadence of a professional delivering data that exceeded his framework. 31 in medium orbit, 5 large installations at the Lagrange points. The Lagrange installations mass between 40 and 60 billion metric tons each. Thermal weathering on outer surfaces suggests continuous occupation for a minimum of 50,000 years. Thyra's hands lay still in her lap. Continue. Ships. 9 vessels in a loose formation above the planet's largest population center. They do not match any class in the continuance database. Not ours. Not any of the 42 species we have contacted. Not any intelligence file on known or projected civilizations. 3 to 5 kilometers in length. Energy signatures suggest power output approximately 3 times that of a continuance dreadnought. 3 times. The continuance dreadnought had been the most powerful warship in known space for 60,000 years. In all the continuance's history, nothing had required that assessment to be revised. The surface, Thyra asked. Urban development across every continental mass. Dense, organized, multi-tiered. Largest concentration on a river delta, northern hemisphere, population exceeds 300 million in that single settlement. Renith paused. An ambassador, an orbital ring. Equatorial, continuous, 40,000 kilometers in circumference. Combined transportation, energy distribution, and defense infrastructure. The continuance maintained 3 orbital rings around its 3 oldest core worlds. Each represented centuries of construction. They were the clearest marker of full orbital mastery, the crown of Veythari engineering, the thing the continuance pointed to when it wanted to demonstrate what a guided civilization could aspire to become. The species below had been chipping tools from bone 300,000 years ago. Thyra closed her eyes. The mission she had prepared for receded like a shore viewed from a departing vessel. When she opened them, she was looking at a different planet than the one she had come to welcome. Descend, she said. Follow their landing vector. We have not received a landing vector, Ambassador. We will. Renith activated the identification transponder, the continuance's version of a raised hand in an empty room. The response came in 11 seconds. Directed communication addressing them by registry designation in Veythari standard diplomatic frequency. Not a challenge, not a query. A landing clearance formatted to continuance specifications, atmospheric corridor, approach speed, surface coordinates. Complete and correct. They knew. They had been watching since the shuttle entered the system, since the outer perimeter, 2 days ago, and had prepared a response in the continuance's own language and format. They know our procedures, Renith said. The flatness had left his voice. What replaced it was closer to awe. Follow the clearance. The shuttle descended through the upper atmosphere, and Earth unfolded. The megacity became visible at 200 kilometers altitude. It filled a river delta that the old survey had mapped as seasonal wetland, and it stretched across the landscape in concentric tiers, a steppe structure rising from the coastal plain in rings, each ring higher than the last. The outermost was a band of engineered green merging with the surrounding biosphere, so seamlessly that the boundary between city and wilderness was a gradient rather than a line. The innermost towers rose so high their upper reaches caught sunlight the lower city had not yet received, their peaks burning gold against the blue-gray dawn that still held the streets below. Transit lines swept between tiers in arcs carrying thousands of vehicles in silent, coordinated flows. Waterways threaded the structure in engineered channels that curved in patterns serving both hydraulic efficiency and aesthetic design. The water itself, a managed resource, its movement through the city as deliberate as the movement of traffic. Parks occupied the spaces between channels, visible from altitude as bands of deep green interspersed with pale stone and reflective water. The biosphere had not been cleared for the city. The city had been built around the biosphere, incorporating it as a structural element the way the Continuance incorporated atmospheric processors into its core world architecture. At 50 kilometers, individual towers resolved, not the functional blocks of the Continuance's early cities. These were articulated, varied, each designed as a distinct work within a larger composition. Slender spires beside broad terrace structures with cascading gardens, massive geometric forms of glass and engineered stone catching the morning light and scattering it across districts below. The architecture had the confidence of a civilization that had been building for longer than most species had existed, and Veythari found herself performing an involuntary comparison. The Continuance's own core worlds, after 600,000 years of continuous development, had architecture of comparable sophistication. These people had reached it in half that time. At 20 kilometers, the warships resolved from below. 9 dark angular forms hanging in the upper atmosphere, each casting a slow-tracking shadow across the city. Hulls detailed with sensor arrays, weapons platforms, launch bays, and systems she could not classify from visual inspection alone. The nearest vessel's broadside showed row upon row of what Renith's instruments identified as directed energy emitters, hundreds of them, each one individually larger than the shuttle's own primary weapon system. The warships were not threatening. They were present, the way a mountain range is present, part of a landscape that has existed long enough to become architecture. At 5 kilometers, people, small figures moving along concourses and transit platforms with the unhurried efficiency of a population for whom the city was terrain. Nobody looked up. Nobody pointed. A diplomatic vessel from an alien civilization was descending toward their city, and the populace carried on as if visitors from the stars were simply another variable in a day that was already accounted for. The shuttle settled onto a circular platform at the base of an innermost tower. The surface absorbed the landing struts without vibration or sound, active dampening, Renith noted quietly, built into the platform itself. Beyond the platform, a broad concourse stretched toward the tower entrance, lined with trees whose canopies filtered morning light into shifting patterns on polished stone. The air that entered when Veythari opened the hatch was warm, clean, and carried the faint mineral metallic scent of high-energy infrastructure running at planetary scale. The scent of a civilization's accumulated power, present everywhere and overwhelming nowhere. A single figure stood at the far end of the concourse. Veythari gathered her diplomatic files, her credentials, her cultural integration package, and 40 years of professional composure, and walked down the ramp. The figure approached, human, male, tall, upper end of biological range, simple dark uniform without insignia, decoration, or weapons, gray at the temples, face lined by decades of focused work rather than age alone. He walked with the pace of a man who had been waiting and was no longer in a hurry. He stopped at 3 meters and inclined his head. Not a bow, not submission, acknowledgement, one professional recognizing another. Ambassador Thyra Vel Annecy, he said, in Veythari, accent-perfect formal register Veythari, the variant the continuance reserved for first contact ceremonies. I am Callum Edris, Director of External Relations for the Terran Compact. Welcome to Earth. Thyra's training held her voice level. Director Edris, I carry credentials and an invitation from the Veythari Continuance. Our records indicate this is a first contact event. He regarded her with patient courtesy, the look of a host who has been expecting a guest and has prepared. We know, he said. We have been expecting you for quite some time. If you will walk with me, I would like to show you something that may help contextualize this meeting. They crossed the concourse together. Renith followed, recording. Above, the orbital ring caught the sun and drew a faint silver line across the sky. Your communications officer identified our spectrum management system, Edris said. Correct. We manage every electromagnetic emission on and around this planet. 260,000 years now. It began as security, passive detection of non-terrestrial signals, and evolved into comprehensive management. Security against what? Against missing a signal, any signal, he glanced at her. Your survey team visited 302,000 years ago, professional, left very little trace, microparticle deposits from atmospheric braking, residual energy signatures from sensor sweeps, a fragment of navigational data jettisoned during the departure burn. Standard practice, the debris is considered negligible. For a species at our stage, it was. Took approximately 6,000 years to develop the capability to detect those traces. Another 2,000 to decode the navigational fragment. From it, we reconstructed your approach vector, sensor pattern, and a partial communications protocol. He paused at the tower entrance, a wide archway opening into an atrium of filtered light. We have spent the remaining 294,000 years learning everything we could from that single fragment and preparing for this meeting. The atrium beyond was vast. Walls surfaced in material that shifted color with the light, ceiling disappearing into atmospheric haze. Through the far wall, transparent floor to ceiling, the city spread in its tiers, warships turning above, the orbital ring stretching from horizon to horizon. 300,000 years of preparation, Thyra said. Since the day we understood we were not alone, everything you see grew from one recognition. The galaxy is occupied, and eventually someone would come. The continuance does not come as a threat. We know, 1,100 worlds, 42 species, all contacted at early interstellar stage, all integrated. He held her gaze with steady clarity, no challenge, no aggression, only the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation across generations. All of them at a stage where the continuance was the most advanced civilization they had encountered, where the invitation was the only rational choice. You are suggesting the invitation assumes developmental asymmetry. I am observing that every contacted species was significantly less advanced. Your integration package offers guidance in exchange for oversight, generous for a species with no alternatives. He turned toward a doorway, different when the species does not need guidance. He opened the door. The gallery ran the full length of the tower's eastern face, 100 meters of curated chronology, lit by the same filtered morning light that filled the atrium. The walls displayed the development of human civilization from the Veythari survey to the present, not as data, not as projections or graphs or abstract visualizations, as artifacts, physical objects preserved or reconstructed, arranged in chronological sequence, 300,000 years compressed into a single room. The earliest tools, stone and bone, displayed without commentary on low pedestals. Then progression, each stage a single object chosen to represent an era. a plow blade whose iron edge still carried the soul darkening of use, a bronze casting whose green patina spoke of the alloy's original composition, a clay tablet inscribed with mathematical notation that Renith's software identified as an early number system, the first evidence of abstract quantitative thinking, a gear mechanism of intricate brass, its teeth still meshing smoothly after preservation, a lens ground from crystal, its focal properties demonstrable even now. Each object was small, specific, and weighted with the transformation it represented. Thyra walked slowly. She had visited diplomatic archives on 40 worlds, and she recognized what Edris was doing, building context, letting the narrative accumulate before its conclusion. But this narrative was unlike any she had encountered. Every other species' artifacts told stories of local problems solved, and local resources mastered, development driven by internal needs, unaware of any larger context. These artifacts told a different story. They told the story of a species building towards something. The timeline accelerated. Printed text on pressed plant fiber, mechanical engines of iron and copper, their internal combustion chambers still visible through cutaway sections, electrical circuits on ceramic substrate, delicate and precise, chemical formulas etched into glass plates, each one a step toward understanding the fundamental structure of matter, a fragment of an early computational device, its components preserved under vacuum. At the gallery's midpoint, the timeline crossed the threshold Thyra recognized, the moment when a species stops developing incrementally and begins developing exponentially, and the nature of the objects changed. They became fewer, larger, stranger. A section of hull plating from Earth's first orbital station, dated year 67,400 post-survey, the metal still carrying the faint radiation signature of its era's propulsion technology. A crystal lattice containing humanity's complete cultural archive from its first millennium of spaceflight. A single object the size of Thyra's fist that held more information than the Continuance's central library had contained at a comparable stage of development. A weapons component from a warship class decommissioned 150,000 years before Thyra was born, its engineering so advanced that Renith's analysis software returned 7 unresolved queries about its operating principles. Between the major milestones, smaller objects told the deeper story. A school textbook, dated year 11,200 post-survey, opened to a page that read, "We are not alone. Everything we build must account for that truth." A civic charter from a city that no longer existed, its founding clause stating, "This settlement is established in the understanding that the galaxy is occupied, and that readiness is the first duty of any human community." A military oath, carved in stone, that bound every soldier who swore it to the defense of a world that has been preparing since the day it learned it was watched. They had institutionalized it. Not as policy, policies could be changed, reversed, forgotten. As identity. Every school, every charter, every oath, every building, all of it built on the foundational understanding that the galaxy existed, and that humanity's place in it depended on what it chose to build while it waited. Thyra stopped before a display case containing a single object, a rough crystal no larger than her thumb, mounted on a simple metal base. The label read, "Fragment recovered from Veythari survey debris, decoded year 8,200 post-survey." This object provided the first confirmation that humanity was not alone. All subsequent preparation derives from what it contained. She stared at it. A standard navigational waste fragment, the kind every Continuance survey vessel jettisoned by the thousands. Negligible, routine, garbage. It had founded a civilization's 300,000-year project. "Every child on Earth visits this room before the age of 10, Edris said beside her. "They stand where you stand and look at that fragment, and learn the lesson everything else is built on." The gallery's final section was empty. No objects, no labels. A single transparent wall looking out over the city, the ring, the warships, the sun. A small plaque, current. Thyra stood before the wall and understood what Edris was showing her. The Continuance's models were accurate for every species that followed the normal curve, the curve leading to the stage where the invitation was the only rational choice. This species had found the debris, understood 6,000 years in that the galaxy was occupied, and spent 300,000 years building toward the moment when contact would come between equals. Your models predicted early interstellar capability, Edris said. Those models have a 96% accuracy rate. Across 42 species, everyone contacted at the moment the Continuance's offer was maximally attractive. A pause. The 4% who declined are absent from your archives. Thyra did not confirm. The observation landed with careful weight. Director Edris, is the Terran Compact declining the Continuance's invitation? We are declining the framework designed for a species needing guidance. He faced her. We are not declining a relationship, but what we propose is not what your credentials authorize. What are you proposing? Beyond the transparent wall, one of the warships adjusted position, a slow rotation, angular mass catching the sun, shadow tracking across the city. Not aggressive. The movement of a thing that had been still for a long time and was now shifting to face a new conversation. A partnership of equals, Edris said, mutual exchange, mutual sovereignty, mutual defense, no oversight, no hierarchy, no cultural package designed to bring us to a standard we have already reached. The Continuance has never entered a partnership on those terms. In 1100 worlds, you have never encountered a species that was ready. He folded his hands behind his back. That is what 300,000 years looks like. Not just weapons, though we built those. Not just infrastructure. Readiness. The understanding that when this day came, we would stand here and say, we do not need what you brought, but we value what you are. Thyra was quiet for a long time. Morning light tracked across the gallery floor. The artifacts on the walls caught light and released it, each one a small bright point in the long arc of a civilization's deliberate preparation. She thought of the 1100 worlds, the 42 species, the Continuance's founding principle, that the galaxy was better served by a network of guided civilizations than by a scattering of isolated ones. She thought of the integration package in her files, its carefully calibrated curriculum of uplift and acculturation, designed for a species that had just discovered it was not alone and needed help understanding what that meant. She thought of the orbital ring, the warships, the megacity, the engineered waterways. 300,000 years of building toward this precise moment, not in fear, not in aggression, but in the disciplined recognition that readiness was the only form of sovereignty that endured. She thought of the word equal. In 40 years and 11 first contact missions, no representative of a contacted species had ever used that word with a Continuance ambassador. Not once. In the Continuance's entire history, no species had been in a position to use it. Director Edris. Ambassador. My credentials do not authorize me to negotiate on the terms you have described. I will need to communicate with the Continuance and recommend they develop an entirely new framework. We anticipated that. Your communications will be unimpeded. We have prepared diplomatic quarters for your delegation. Environmental specifications matched to Veythari standard, derived from your survey team's residual traces. You built quarters for us, using data from 300,000 years ago. We built quarters for whoever came. We have accommodations prepared for 17 different species profiles, based on fragmentary data collected over centuries. Yours are the most complete because your survey team was the most thorough. You have been preparing quarters for species you have never met. We have been preparing for everything, Ambassador. That is what readiness means. The diplomatic quarters occupied an entire floor of the tower. Environmental controls were set before Thera arrived. Temperature matched to Veythari, standard within a fraction of a degree, atmospheric composition, adjusted for respiratory comfort with trace elements that Thera recognized as Veythari atmospheric markers. Subtleties that even the Continuance's own diplomatic facilities sometimes missed when hosting visiting species. Lighting was calibrated to the spectrum her eyes found restful. The furnishings were scaled to Veythari proportions, not copies of Veythari furniture, but original designs built around ergonomic data derived from engine, exhaust particles, and sensor calibration artifacts 300 millennia old. Thyra sat in a chair designed for her body by people who had never seen one. It fit perfectly. Director. A question outside protocol. Of course. Why, you had no guarantee anyone would come. The survey team visited once, left, no promise of return. You built all of this on the chance that someday someone would arrive. Edris leaned against the doorframe. For the first time, his professional composure softened, not into vulnerability, but into something older and more personal. The expression of a man standing at the end of a long chain of effort and being asked to explain the first link. Because we found the debris, he said. 6,000 years after your team left, a group of our early scientists, they would not have recognized the word scientist. They called themselves something closer to pattern readers, found microparticle deposits in a mountain glacier. They could not identify the particles, could not explain their composition, structure, or distribution, but they recognized one thing: the particles were not natural. Something had made them, something not from this world. He straightened. That recognition is the most important moment in human history. Not fire, not agriculture, not spaceflight. The moment we understood we were not alone. Because from that moment, every decision we made, every tool we built, every institution we founded, every law we wrote, every ship we launched was made in the context of that understanding. We build because we know the galaxy is occupied. We prepare because we know that what is out there is older, more experienced, and more organized than we are. We do not build in fear. We build in the certainty that readiness is the only posture that preserves our ability to choose. Choose what? The terms of our participation, whether we enter the galaxy as clients or as equals, whether we accept oversight or stand on our own. He looked at her directly. The Continuance has contacted 42 species, and everyone accepted your invitation because they had no meaningful alternative. We wanted to be the first species that accepted your friendship because we chose to, not because we had to. The words settled into the room. Friendship, not partnership, not alliance, not diplomatic arrangement, friendship. The word of a species that had spent 300,000 years preparing to meet the galaxy and had decided, somewhere in that preparation, that the thing it wanted most was not power or security or territorial advantage, but the chance to meet another civilization as a friend. Thyra sat in her perfectly designed chair and looked at the man in the doorway, and understood that the Continuance had not merely encountered a species that exceeded its models. It had encountered a species that exceeded its imagination. I will send my communication to the Continuance now, she said. During the wait, I accept your offer to understand what you have built, as a professional courtesy between equals. Edris nodded. Behind his composure, visible now that she knew to look, was something she would spend the rest of her career trying to describe to the Continuance's governing council. The quiet confidence of a species that had used every one of 300,000 years to become something no model had predicted, and no framework had been designed to accommodate. It would be our honor, Ambassador. We have waited a long time to show someone. Over the following 6 days, while the Continuance deliberated, Edris showed Thyra what humanity had built. On the second day, he took her to the Argent Dockyards, a 40-kilometer orbital construction facility in medium orbit above the equatorial city of Solace. The facility was a lattice of construction bays and material processing nodes that assembled the Terran Compact's warship fleet with a production cadence the Continuance's own shipyards could not match. 3 vessels were under construction during her visit, angular, dense with systems, their unfinished hulls open to vacuum like split fruit showing complex internal architecture. The foreman, a woman named Cade who spoke competent Veythari without an interpreter, walked them through the production line. She explained how each vessel was designed against a threat profile refined across 200,000 years of study. Threat profiles built not from combat experience, because humanity had never fought an interstellar war, but from analysis of every scrap of alien technology and every navigational trace that the Long Watch had collected since its founding. You build warships against threats you have never faced, Thyra said. We build against every threat we can model, Cade said. The preparation is the point. Every warship is a statement that we chose to be ready rather than surprised. The nearest hull was 4.5 kilometers of engineered metal and composite. Its plating was layered, 3 distinct materials bonded at the molecular level, each layer serving a different defensive function. The outermost was ablative, designed to absorb directed energy strikes. The middle was structural, a lattice of engineered crystal that distributed kinetic impacts across the entire surface. The innermost was what Cade described as responsive, a material capable of altering its physical properties based on the type of attack it received, hardening against kinetic threats, dispersing against energy weapons, and sealing against chemical or biological agents, all autonomously, without crew input. We developed the base material approximately 40,000 years ago, Cade said. This is the 9,000th iteration. 9,000 iterations of a defensive material for a war that had never been fought. Thyra ran her hand along the hull. The surface was smooth, warm with residual construction energy, and alive with the faint vibration of molecular systems testing themselves at the microscopic level. On the 3rd day, Edris took her to the deep archives beneath the northern megacity of Thrace. The archives extended 9 kilometers below the surface, crystal storage vaults, environmental preservation chambers, and research laboratories containing the complete material record of human civilization from the Veythari survey to the present. The archivists worked in quiet, temperature-controlled rooms. Cataloging with the meticulous care of a species that understood memory was the foundation of readiness. Thyra spent 4 hours in the earliest section. Stone tools, ceramic fragments, woven textiles preserved in vacuum cases, each annotated with provenance connecting it to the larger narrative. A stone blade was not merely a stone blade but evidence of a species' capacity to identify a need and invent a solution, the same capacity that, scaled across 300 millennia, had produced the orbital ring and the warship fleet. The lead archivist was a woman named Sorrel who had spent 60 years underground and who spoke about the collection with the reverence of a priest and the precision of an engineer. "You archive everything," Thyra said. "Everything. Because the stone blade and the warship are the same impulse, the same species responding to the same question. What do we need to be ready for, and how do we build it? If we lose the blade, we lose the thread that connects us to the beginning of the answer." On the 4th day, Edris took her to the Vantage, a high-altitude observation post perched on a mountain ridge at the western edge of the northern continent, 12 kilometers above sea level. One of the oldest continuously occupied structures on Earth, its foundations dated to year 14,000 post-survey. The original structure had been a stone watchtower. Over 288,000 years, it had become a sprawling complex of sensor arrays, research laboratories, and diplomatic facilities integrated into the mountain so seamlessly that from certain angles it was impossible to tell where stone ended and engineering began. The monitoring facility beneath the Vantage was the nerve center of the Long Watch, the planet-wide detection system that had been scanning the sky for 300,000 years. Thyra stood in the operations room and looked at the displays, a three-dimensional projection of the solar system with every object larger than a meter tagged, tracked, and identified. Her shuttle was marked in blue. The orbital stations and Lagrange installations pulsed green. The warship fleet amber, the ring white. And extending outward, reaching to the display's edge, a web of sensor contacts, distant ships, stellar phenomena, interstellar medium-density readings, and at the very limit of detection, faint traces of vessels moving through the deeper galaxy. "You track traffic beyond your own system," Thyra said. The watch commander was a man named Terran, who had the calm patience of someone who had spent his career watching screens that showed nothing and being grateful for it. "We track everything we can detect. The Long Watch's mandate is early detection. In 288,000 years, we have detected approximately 11,000 transient contacts, ships or probes passing through the outer solar perimeter. 11,000, and none stopped. None stopped. Most were too distant for identification. A few left debris. From that debris, we identified 17 different civilizations. 17. The Continuance's database contained 42. The humans had identified 17 from debris alone. "And you prepared for all of them," Thyra said. "For each one we developed a species profile, a technological assessment, a projected threat model, and a preliminary diplomatic protocol, in case they were the ones who came back." Terran gave her a look that contained, beneath its professional courtesy, the faintest edge of quiet pride. "You were not the only civilization we prepared for, Ambassador. You were simply the first to arrive." Thyra looked at the displays and thought about what it meant. A species that had spent 300,000 years preparing not just for one visitor, but for any visitor, building readiness as a general principle rather than a specific defense, preparing to meet the galaxy on whatever terms the galaxy chose to present itself. On the 5th day, Edris took her to see the orbital ring from above. They rode a transport to the ring's equatorial station, a city within a structure embedded in the ring itself, the central hub for transportation, energy distribution, and defense. From the observation deck, the ring stretched in both directions, curving until it vanished behind the horizon. Below, the planet turned green and blue and white, megacities visible as geometric patterns, oceans catching the sun. "Completed approximately 180,000 years ago," Edris said. 12,000 years to build. The largest structure humanity has ever constructed. "Transportation, energy, defense," Thyra said. "And a fourth function we do not advertise. The ring is a beacon. Its energy signature is detectable from approximately 400 light years. Any civilization scanning at that range would identify it as artificial." He paused. "We built it in part to be seen. You wanted to be found. We wanted to be found on our own terms. A species that builds an orbital ring is not a species that needs to be guided. It is a species that is ready to be met." Thyra looked at the ring and the planet and understood the full scope. They had not merely prepared for contact. They had engineered the contact itself, building a beacon to ensure that whoever came would find them at maximum readiness, at the precise moment when the meeting would be between equals. 300,000 years of building toward one conversation, and that conversation was happening now. That evening, Thyra composed her first interim report to the Continuance from the diplomatic quarters. She wrote 3 drafts and deleted them all. Each attempted to describe what she had found in the standard contact report format: species profile, developmental stage, technological assessment, integration recommendation. And each failed, because the format assumed a species that fit within the Continuance's existing categories. This one did not. Her 4th draft abandoned the format entirely. It began: "The species on Sol 3 has exceeded every parameter in our developmental models by a margin I cannot quantify using our existing assessment framework. They are not at the early interstellar stage. They are at, or near, our own level of development. They achieved this without contact, without guidance, and without the network advantage that has accelerated every species we have ever integrated. They did it alone, driven by the knowledge that we exist, and they did it deliberately, not in reaction to a threat, but in preparation for a meeting they believed was inevitable and which they wished to enter as equals. She paused, then added, I recommend that the Continuance develop a new diplomatic framework for this contact. The standard cultural integration package is not applicable. The standard invitation is not appropriate. What is appropriate, I believe, is something the Continuance has never offered, a relationship between peers. She reviewed the paragraph, checking each claim against what she had observed. The warship energy output 3 times a dreadnought's, confirmed by Renith's instruments. The orbital ring, verified during the descent. Its infrastructure clearly operational and multifunctional. The spectrum management, planet-wide total, a capability the Continuance had not achieved until 80,000 years post-spaceflight. The atmospheric engineering, precise, comprehensive, the mark of a civilization that managed its biosphere the way the Continuance managed its core worlds. The deep archives, 9 kilometers of crystal-stored memory, a civilization that had institutionalized remembering the way others institutionalized government. Every claim held. She transmitted the draft and sat in the warm light of the diplomatic quarters, looking at the city through the window as it performed its nightly illumination sequence, and waited. On the afternoon of the 4th day, before the Vantage visit, Edris took her through a district of the megacity that he called the Remembrance Quarter. It occupied the innermost ring's southern arc, a wedge of the city's core given over not to government or industry, but to memory. The quarter was composed of memorial structures, each one dedicated to a different era of human development. They were not monuments in the sense Thyra understood from the Continuance's ceremonial architecture. They were not celebrations of victory or tributes to heroes. They were records. Each structure contained the complete documentary archive of its era. The decisions made, the resources committed, the failures endured, the progress achieved. We do not celebrate our readiness, Edris said as they walked through a structure dedicated to the era of first spaceflight. We document it. Celebration implies the work is finished. Documentation implies it continues. The first spaceflight memorial contained, among thousands of other artifacts, the mission logs of the first human vessel to leave the solar system, a journey that had taken place approximately 240,000 years ago and had lasted 11 years. The vessel had been primitive by current standards, barely capable of sustaining its crew across the interstellar gap. But it had carried, in addition to its scientific instruments and its provisions and its crew of 12, a sealed archive containing the complete record of human civilization, from the discovery of the Veythari debris to the date of launch. The archive had been deposited at the vessel's destination, a lifeless planet orbiting a nearby star, and left there as a marker. Why? Thyra asked. Because we wanted the galaxy to know we had been there, Edris said. Not as a territorial claim, as an introduction. If any other species found the archive before we made contact, they would know who we were, how we had developed, and what we intended. We wanted our first impression to be comprehensive. The archive had never been found by another species, but the practice had continued. Over 240,000 years, humanity had deposited similar archives at every stellar system it had visited, comprehensive records of human civilization, updated with each new deposit, left at every destination as a standing introduction to whoever might eventually find them. You have been introducing yourselves to empty rooms for 250,000 years, Thyra said. We have been practicing. Every introduction is a rehearsal for the one that matters. And every archive is a promise. If you find this, know that we are waiting and that we are ready. Thyra looked at the mission logs on the memorial's walls, the careful, precise records of a crew that had crossed interstellar space in a vessel barely adequate for the journey, carrying an archive of their entire civilization's history as a gift for a recipient that might never exist, and felt something shift in her understanding that was deeper than professional reassessment. It was something closer to recognition. The Continuance went out into the galaxy to find younger species and welcome them. The humans went out into the galaxy to leave introductions and wait. Both methods were expressions of the same fundamental impulse, the desire not to be alone. The difference was that the Continuance had always assumed it would be the one doing the welcoming. The humans had prepared for the possibility that they might be the ones welcomed, and had spent 300,000 years ensuring that, when that moment came, they would be worth welcoming. On the afternoon of the 5th day, after the ring visit, Edris took her to the Terran Compact's diplomatic reception hall in the megacity's central tower, the facility that had been built specifically for the event that was now occurring. The hall occupied the tower's uppermost floor, 5,300 meters above the city's base level. The ceiling was transparent, showing the sky above the city, the orbital ring, the warships, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue. The walls were lined with alcoves, each one containing a set of objects, communication devices, translation matrices, cultural reference materials, and environmental adaptation equipment. 17 alcoves, 17 different species profiles. "These are the contact kits," Edris said. "One for each species we identified from debris analysis. Each kit contains everything we estimated would be needed for a successful first contact meeting with that species. Communication protocols, atmospheric and gravitational accommodation, cultural reference materials, dietary provisions, and a preliminary diplomatic vocabulary in the species' estimated language structure." Thyra walked along the alcoves. Each one was labeled with a designation, not the species name, because in most cases humanity did not know the species name, but a catalog number and a set of physical parameters. Species Profile 4, estimated bilateral symmetry, oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, visual communication dominant. Species Profile 11, estimated radial symmetry, methane atmosphere, vibrational communication dominant. Species Profile 16, estimated bilateral symmetry, oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, electromagnetic communication dominant. The alcove for Species Profile 1 was the most complete. Its label read, Veythari Continuance, bilateral symmetry, oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, adjusted parameters attached, visual and auditory communication dominant. Diplomatic protocols reconstructed from navigational debris fragment, supplemented by long-range signal analysis. Language structure, agglutinative formal register dominant in diplomatic contexts. Estimated cultural values, patience, structured hierarchy, beneficence toward younger species. The cultural reference materials in the alcove included a reconstructed grammar of the Veythari language, not complete, but functional, built from the partial communications protocol in the navigational fragment, and from 300,000 years of analysis of every scrap of electromagnetic data that the Long Watch had ever intercepted from Veythari sources passing through the outer solar perimeter. The grammar was 91% accurate. Thyra checked it against her own knowledge of formal register Veythari and found 7 errors in 300 pages. 7 errors, reconstructed from garbage and distant signals over 300,000 years. "How long did this take?" she asked. The first functional grammar was completed approximately 60,000 years ago. It has been refined continuously since then. The current version is the 412th edition. 412 editions of a grammar for a language whose speakers had never visited, never communicated directly, and might never have returned. 412 editions of preparation for a conversation that might never happen. Thyra closed the grammar and looked at Edris. He was standing by the transparent ceiling, his face lit from above by the orbital ring's reflected light. His expression was patient and professional, as it always was, but she had learned over 5 days to read what lay beneath the professionalism. The quiet, bone-deep satisfaction of a man who had spent his career preparing for this moment and was watching it unfold exactly as his civilization had planned. Director, Ambassador, your species has spent 300,000 years preparing for a conversation. What if we had not come? Then the next generation would have continued preparing, and the generation after that, and the one after that. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but carried the same warmth. Readiness is not conditional, Ambassador. It does not depend on the outcome. It depends on the commitment. We decided 300,000 years ago that we would be ready for whoever came, whenever they came, however they came. If that meant waiting another 300,000 years, we would have waited. You would have maintained all of this, the fleet, the ring, the detection mesh, the archives, the contact kits, for another 300,000 years, with no guarantee of return. We maintained it for the first 300,000 with no guarantee. The second would not have been different. Thyra stood in the hall with the 17 alcoves and the transparent ceiling and the light of the orbital ring overhead, and understood something about this species that went beyond technological assessment or diplomatic categorization. It was not merely that they had built impressive things. It was that they had built them in the sustained, unwavering certainty that the building itself was the purpose. That readiness was not a state to be achieved and then relaxed, but a continuous practice, a discipline, a way of being that defined who they were as a civilization. The Continuance's patience was strategic. It waited because waiting produced results. Species developed, contact windows opened, invitations were accepted. Humanity's patience was existential. It waited because waiting was the right thing to do. Because the galaxy was occupied and being prepared to meet it with dignity was a moral obligation, not a strategic calculation. The distinction was subtle, but Thyra realized it was the most important thing she had learned since arriving. It explained the warships and the ring and the archives and the contact kits and the grammar with 412 editions and the chair and the diplomatic quarters that fit her body perfectly. All of it was built not because it would produce a specific result, but because building it was the right response to the knowledge that the galaxy existed. On the evening of the 5th day, Thyra stood on the Vantage's observation deck alone. Edris had excused himself for administrative matters, and she had asked to remain. The mountain air was thin and cold at this altitude, but the environmental field that enclosed the deck maintained Veythari comfortable conditions, another detail that the humans had quietly accounted for. The sun was setting behind the orbital ring. The ring caught the last light and held it as a thin, bright line bisecting the sky, turning the western horizon into a gradient of gold and silver and deep atmospheric blue. Below, the megacity of Thrace was lighting up not all at once, but in a coordinated sequence that moved outward from the center in expanding rings, each tier illuminating as twilight deepened. The pattern transformed the city from a structure into a constellation, its lights reflected in the engineered waterways, until the entire river delta seemed to float on a field of stars. Thyra had watched sunsets on 27 worlds. She had watched them from the observation decks of Continuance diplomatic cruisers, from the towers of newly contacted species capitals, from the surfaces of planets that had never known an intelligent footprint. She had learned over 40 years that sunsets were one of the few experiences that translated across species without cultural context. The simple aesthetic pleasure of light changing, of a day ending, of the world's geometry revealing itself through the movement of its star. This sunset was different, not because the light was unusual or the colors exceptional, but because of what the light fell on. Every structure visible from this deck, the city below, the orbital ring above, the warships in the darkening sky, the Lagrange installations that were now visible as faint points of light in the east. All of it had been built by a species that had used a handful of garbage particles as the starting point for 300 millennia of deliberate, disciplined, patient civilization building. She thought about the Continuance, 600,000 years old, the oldest civilization in the known galaxy. Its founding myth was one of exploration and benevolence. They had gone out into the galaxy, found younger species, and welcomed them into a network of mutual benefit. They had guided 42 civilizations from their first uncertain steps into interstellar space to full membership in a galactic community. They had done this with patience, with generosity, and with the quiet confidence of a civilization that had never met its equal. The confidence had been justified. In 600,000 years, the Continuance had never encountered a species that did not need what it offered. The cultural integration package had worked every time, not because it was coercive, but because it was genuinely helpful, and because every species it was offered to had genuinely needed the help. And now a species had been found that did not need the help. A species that had taken a single clue, a fragment of navigational garbage, and used it to build itself into something that the Continuance had never imagined could exist, a peer, an equal, a civilization that had reached the Continuance's own level of development without the Continuance's guidance, without its network, without its resources, alone, deliberately, patiently. The Continuance would have to change. Thyra understood that with the clarity of a professional who has spent her career inside an institution and has just seen the thing that will transform it. The founding principle that the galaxy was best served by guided civilizations under Continuance oversight would not survive contact with a species that had guided itself. The principle was not wrong. It had worked for 42 species, but it was incomplete. It had never accounted for the possibility that a species might not need guidance. That possibility had seemed, to every generation of Continuance diplomats, too unlikely to plan for. The humans had planned for it. They had planned for everything. The irony was not lost on Thyra. The Continuance's method was patience. Wait for species to develop, arrive when they are ready. The humans' method was the same: patience. Wait for the galaxy to come. Be ready when it arrives. Two patient civilizations, waiting for each other, each building toward the same conversation from opposite ends of the galaxy. She watched the last light fade from the orbital ring and thought about what the next 14 months would hold. The Continuance's delegation was coming, 40 diplomats, the largest first contact team ever assembled. They would arrive expecting to negotiate with a species at the early interstellar stage. They would find something else entirely. They would need to be prepared, the way Thyra had not been prepared, for the shock of encountering a civilization that did not fit any existing category. She would prepare them. That was her job now, not to deliver the Continuance's gift, but to explain why the gift was no longer appropriate. To describe, in language the Continuance could understand, a species that had spent 300,000 years building the capacity to decline a gift gracefully and to offer friendship instead. On the 6th day, the Continuance's reply arrived. Thyra was in her quarters, writing her daily field report, when the communication relay chimed. The Continuance's diplomatic encryption was familiar. The response header was not. It carried an emergency session marker, a full council authorization stamp, and a classification level indicating the message had been reviewed by every senior diplomat and council member before transmission. The message was 3 words long. Proceed as equals. The attached advisory was longer. The governing council had convened in emergency session for the first time in 12,000 years. 17 frameworks proposed, debated, and discarded. 3 members had resigned in protest, arguing the founding principle of guided integration could not accommodate parity. 4 argued the principle should expand. The remaining members voted unanimously. A full delegation of 40 members, the largest first contact team in Continuance history, would follow in 14 months. In the interim, Ambassador Veythari had the Continuance's full authority to negotiate, establish agreements, and represent the Continuance in any capacity the situation required. The advisory's final line: the Council recognizes that Sol 3 represents a circumstance without precedent. We trust Ambassador Veythari's judgment. In 40 years, no advisory from the Council had used the word trust. Veythari closed the message, stood, straightened her uniform, and walked out of her quarters into the morning. Edris was waiting in the atrium. He held 2 small cups of a dark liquid that steamed in the air. "A human custom," he said, offering one. "We share a warm drink when beginning something important." Veythari took the cup. The liquid was bitter and complex and unlike anything in the Continuance's catalog. She drank. The warmth of it spread through her chest, and she decided, with the professional precision that characterized all her assessments, that it was not unpleasant. "The Continuance has authorized me to proceed on the terms you proposed," she said. Edris nodded. His expression was calm and professional, but his hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady as he raised his own cup. 300,000 years of waiting, and the answer had come. They stood in the atrium with morning light streaming through transparent walls and the city stretching before them and the warships turning in the brightening sky. And they drank in silence, and the silence was not empty. It was the silence of 2 civilizations that had found each other and discovered the meeting was worth everything it had cost to prepare for. Later that day, Veythari would begin drafting the framework for the first equal partnership in the Continuance's history. She would work for weeks, consulting with Edris and his staff, building a document that neither civilization had needed before. The work would be difficult not because of disagreement, but because there was no precedent. Every template the Continuance possessed assumed asymmetry. Every clause assumed one party was the guide and the other the guided. Stripping that assumption and replacing it with parity required reimagining the Continuance's diplomatic architecture from the foundation up. She would do it. It would take the full 14 months before the delegation arrived. And when the delegation's senior diplomat read the framework, he would sit in silence for 20 minutes before saying, "Ambassador, you have just changed the Continuance." But that was later. In the atrium, with the warm cup in her hands and the quiet professional beside her, and the city that patience built spreading to every horizon, there was only the beginning. Above the city, along the inner surface of the orbital ring, inscribed in characters visible only from certain angles, 2 lines of text caught the morning sun. The first was in Veythari. "We learned your language first so that when you came, we could welcome you in your own words." The second was in human script, angular and precise and 300,000 years in the making. "We never forgot that you were coming. We only hoped that when you arrived, you would see what we became." Veythari would read those lines later, from the deck of an orbital transport heading to the ring station to send her supplementary report to the Continuance. She would stand very still for a long time afterward, her hands flat on the observation rail, the inscription burning against the sky. But in the atrium, with the morning light on her face, there was only the warmth of the cup, the steadiness of the man beside her, and the knowledge, shared now between 2 civilizations, one ancient and one patient, that the long wait was over, and what came next was something neither had built alone but both had been building toward since the first survey team left a trail of particles in the upper atmosphere of a world it had called promising. The conversation had started, and the planet that had spent 300 millennia preparing for this exact moment continued, as it always had, to turn.